911, what is your emergency?
It's my neighbor, David, and he kept these giant lizards, and now they're all over him.
Stay calm. Are you saying the animals are attacking him right now?
Yes, they're tearing at him. There's nothing left I can do.
Stand back, please.
By the time authorities arrived, the scene was beyond comprehension. Inside a modest suburban home, a man lay partially consumed by the very monitor lizards he had raised, fed, and trusted for decades. Flashing red and blue lights washed over the quiet street as neighbors watched in disbelief, their whispers breaking against the silence. This was no random act of nature. This was the final chapter of a life built around obsession, a devotion that blurred the line between fascination and fatality. David Camper was not just a reptile collector. To him, these creatures were family. But instinct has no sentiment, and hunger knows no loyalty. His final hours reveal a disturbing truth. When passion blinds us, it can invite tragedy into our own living rooms. This is Animal Shock Stories. Subscribe for more true accounts of nature's darkest intersections with human life, and tell us in the comments what you think about the thin line between love for wild animals and the danger they hold. David Camper was a man whose very presence seemed to hover at the edges of ordinary life, a figure in his late 40s who rarely ventured into the rhythms of the neighborhood except for the quiet, deliberate ritual of carrying bulging grocery bags that leaked the faint smell of raw meat. To most who glimpsed him, he was an enigma, someone who waved politely when addressed but never lingered, a man who slipped back behind the walls of his dimly lit home as though the outside world was no longer his habitat. Whispers spread over years about what lived inside with him. Massive monitor lizards, sleek-bodied and ancient-eyed, their movements heavy with a weight of time that no suburban cage could soften. To some neighbors, he was eccentric, to others, unsettling, yet all agreed he was wholly devoted, perhaps consumed, by his reptiles. Where other men his age spoke of careers or families, David's life was measured in feedings, in enclosure cleanings, in the steady hissing sounds that occasionally carried through cracked windows. There was something oddly reverent about the way he moved, the way he cradled slabs of meat in both arms as though bearing offerings to an altar. He never bragged, never invited others in to see the collection that defined him. Instead, he lived in an unspoken pact of secrecy, a private kingdom where scaled creatures reigned. Those who encountered him in passing often remarked on his eyes tired, shadowed, yet glinting with a kind of quiet fervor, as if his true communion was not with people, but with the animals that stalked the dark corners of his home. He dressed simply, jeans and faded shirts, his clothes often marked by small tears or streaks of dirt, as though he belonged more to the enclosures than the street he walked on. Over time, people stopped asking about his life, stopped inviting him to neighborhood gatherings, stopped waiting for him to show up at holiday barbecues or seasonal fairs. He became a ghost who lived only a few steps away, his reality carried in whispers, "That's the lizard man," spoken in hushed tones by parents, warning children not to stray near his yard. Yet, despite the isolation, despite the mounting oddities that hung around his name, David carried himself with a strange dignity, a man convinced that he was chosen to understand something primal that others dismissed or feared. Every evening, when the sun sank and porch lights flicked on across the street, he would retreat inside with his groceries, and behind closed doors begin the elaborate rituals of feeding and care, each motion more like devotion than duty. In those moments, he did not seem reclusive or eccentric. He seemed fulfilled, as though the world had finally receded into silence, leaving only him and the low, guttural breathing of the reptiles he loved beyond reason. As a boy, David Camper was never drawn to the things that pulled at his peers, the roar of a football crowd, the glitter of new bikes, the rush of summer nights with friends. His gaze was instead fixed on the margins of fields and creek beds, where shadows moved just a little differently, where scales shimmered faintly beneath the brush. At 13, while other children hoarded comic books or baseball cards, David crouched in the tall grass with a jar in hand, capturing garter snakes and salamanders with the patience of a monk gathering relics. His bedroom became a strange shrine, lined with tanks buzzing under fluorescent light, each one filled with creatures that unsettled his parents, but fascinated him endlessly. Teachers remembered him as quiet, solitary, yet lit up when he spoke of reptile biology. His notebooks were crowded with sketches of scales and claws, his essays filled with passages about misunderstood predators. The more people recoiled from his passion, the deeper he sank into it, taking their fear as proof of his calling to defend what others dismissed as monstrous. By high school, his collection had grown, each tank a universe of its own corn snakes that wrapped themselves lazily around branches, iguanas that blinked with ancient indifference, small monitors whose tongues flickered like tiny flames in the dark. While classmates chased romance and parties, David found companionship in the unblinking stares of cold-blooded animals, a companionship that asked nothing of him except devotion. His parents worried, tried to nudge him toward more conventional pursuits, but he resisted with a quiet, stubborn persistence. To him, reptiles were not simply pets, they were symbols of resilience, survivors from a world older and harsher than humanity itself. When others saw danger, he saw grace. When they saw predators, he saw misunderstood creatures fighting for existence. Over time, this lens through which he viewed the world fused with his own identity until David could not imagine himself without the steady presence of scales and claws around him. His adolescence became a rehearsal for the life he would one day fully inhabit, each enclosure in his bedroom a foreshadowing of the kingdom he would later build inside his adult home. He was no longer just a boy with an unusual hobby. He was the defender of the feared, the caretaker of the forgotten, a man shaping himself around the quiet pulse of animals most people never dared to touch. What began as fascination had transformed into something heavier, deeper, and irreversible, an obsession that would carry him away from the world of people and bind him forever to the creatures that others instinctively kept at arm's length. Monitor lizards are not creatures easily mistaken for harmless pets. They are relics from an age when reptiles ruled the earth, their bodies carved by survival into muscular frames and coiled power. To watch them move is to witness something ancient and deliberate, long tails swaying like pendulums, claws scratching with a sound that echoes bone against stone, eyes fixed with a patience that feels more like calculation than instinct. They are carnivores, built for tearing, for swallowing whole, for consuming without hesitation, yet there is a stark beauty in their design. The shimmer of scales that ripple under dim light, the elegance of muscles rolling beneath taut skin, the stillness they hold before sudden bursts of speed. David often stood before his monitors in silence, regarding them as both predators and teachers, creatures that demanded respect but offered a strange reflection of his own solitude. They were beautiful in a way that frightened others, dangerous in a way that drew him closer. He described them once in his private journal as shadows with claws, a phrase that captured both their menace and allure, their ability to drift silently through their enclosures until the moment they revealed what they were capable of. In their presence, the boundaries of time seemed to blur. They belonged less to a suburban living room and more to a prehistoric swamp where survival was the only law. Their forked tongues flickered through the air, not simply to taste, but to remind anyone watching that they were never tame, only tolerating, always alert to weakness or opportunity. To David, their unyielding nature was not a warning but a kind of truth. They did not mask themselves, did not pretend to be docile companions. They were predators that lived without deception. In a world where human beings so often cloaked themselves in pretense and performance, he found a strange purity in their raw presence. Yet that purity carried a razor's edge, for beauty and danger in the form of a monitor lizard were inseparable, two halves of the same truth, and standing too close meant surrendering to the possibility that one day, instinct would rise up from beneath the still surface and remind the observer who truly held power. Over the years, the edges of David Camper's life frayed quietly as friends and family began to distance themselves, first with gentle concern and later with a kind of exhausted resignation. His sister recalled visiting once and leaving shaken after hearing the deep, rasping breaths of the lizards in the next room, their claws scraping against glass as David spoke to them in soft, reassuring tones. "They know me," he told her when she questioned his safety, his voice carrying both pride and irritation, as though the very suggestion of risk was an insult to the bond he believed he had forged. Friends, too, tried to intervene. One urged him to consider donating the reptiles to a sanctuary. Another pleaded with him to downsize before something went wrong, but each time David's reply was the same: a calm dismissal paired with a claim that he understood them better than people. To him, warnings were evidence of ignorance, and every raised eyebrow or hushed conversation about his animals only deepened his resolve to prove them all wrong. Authorities even stepped in once, responding to a tip about the number and size of the monitors he kept. Inspectors walked through his dim, humid enclosures, noting the strength of the cages, the smell of raw meat, the way the lizards tracked their every step with unblinking eyes. Regulations gave them little grounds to act, and David, polite but curt, guided them out with the confidence of a man who knew he was untouchable. "They're fine here," he told them. "Safer with me than in the wild." But beneath his assurance was an undercurrent of obsession that no legal code could measure. Neighbors whispered when lights burned late and shadows moved behind drawn curtains, yet no one pressed further, unwilling to confront the strange fortress David had built for himself and his reptiles. His isolation grew thicker, layered by every warning he ignored, until the voices of others no longer reached him at all. By the time his parents passed, by the time his sister stopped calling, by the time his circle of friends had collapsed to nothing, David stood alone with the lizards, his last companions, his chosen family. To him, this was not loss but liberation, proof that he had transcended the need for human connection. Yet, in the silence of his home, punctuated only by the scrape of claws and the hiss of breath, the warnings hung like unanswered echoes, a chorus of cautions he would never hear again until it was far too late. Every day of David Camper's life unfolded according to a rhythm that blurred the line between devotion and compulsion, a carefully maintained sequence of tasks that gave his home the air of a shrine rather than a residence. In the morning, he would rise early, slipping into the kitchen to prepare food not for himself, but for the lizard slabs of raw chicken, fish, and the occasional rabbit neatly arranged on trays as though he were hosting a meal for honored guests. He moved with slow precision, slicing and portioning, his hands steady, his expression almost serene, and when he carried the offerings into the reptile room, there was a kind of reverence in his steps, as if each journey across the threshold marked the beginning of a sacred ritual. The cages themselves demanded endless upkeep, glass panes wiped free of smudges, water dishes scrubbed and refilled, bedding replaced, heating lamps adjusted with the care of a jeweler handling fine instruments. Hours passed in this routine, the hiss of misting bottles and the clink of feeding tongs filling the air like a strange music. In those moments, David seemed content, speaking softly to the monitors as though they were children, murmuring reassurances while they tore into meat with their daggered teeth. There was tenderness in the way he lingered at each enclosure, watching their slow movements with quiet admiration, whispering phrases no one else would hear: "Good girl," "Steady boy," "Easy now." To him, their acknowledgement, even if only a flick of the tongue or a steady, unblinking stare, was proof of trust, a confirmation that he belonged with them as much as they with him. And yet beneath the calm repetition, beneath the veil of care, an unease lingered like a shadow pressed against glass. Every cage he cleaned placed him inches from claws capable of tearing flesh. Every tray of food slid across the floor carried the risk of turning him from provider into prey. The house smelled of raw meat and damp earth, heavy with an atmosphere that kept visitors away, but wrapped David in a cocoon of belonging. To outsiders, it would have felt oppressive, but to him it was sanctuary, a place where the world's noise could not intrude, where he and his lizards shared a peace that no one else could understand. But that peace was fragile, like glass stretched too thin, an illusion that could shatter with the smallest shift in balance. And though David never admitted it, part of him knew each ritual was not only about feeding and cleaning, but about keeping danger at bay. maintaining a tenuous truce between man and beast that might not hold forever. The signs began as whispers in the silence of his home, small disturbances that most would have recognized as warnings, but that David folded neatly into his daily routine, dismissing them with the quiet stubbornness of a man unwilling to believe the creatures he loved could ever turn against him. The lizards, once slow and deliberate in their movements, began to pace the length of their enclosures with restless energy, claws raking against glass with a harshness that made neighbors wince when the sound carried through open windows. At night, sharp thuds echoed from the reptile room as heavy bodies slammed into walls or toppled feeding trays, the sudden violence jolting David awake, but never truly shaking his conviction. When asked about it once by a concerned neighbor, another time by a cousin who stopped by unannounced, he waved away the concern with the same explanation: "They're just restless." His tone was calm, almost reassuring, but his eyes betrayed the faintest trace of exhaustion, as though the strain of keeping order was heavier than he let on. Scratches appeared more frequently on his forearms, jagged lines that he dismissed as accidents from cleaning cages too quickly. On one occasion, a delivery man swore he heard a low, guttural hiss so powerful it seemed to vibrate the air, followed by a crash that rattled the walls. But David only smiled faintly, signing for his package with a hand still smudged in what looked like dried blood from a cut. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. The stillness that once felt sacred now pulsed with something more volatile, a tension coiled in the shadows of every corner. The lizard's eyes seemed sharper, their movements quicker, their patience thinning with each passing week. Yet David, rather than retreat, leaned deeper into his rituals, determined to convince himself that the bond he had built would not fracture. To him, aggression was not a threat but a challenge, a test of trust that he believed he had already passed. But to those who overheard the escalating chaos, to those who noticed the way his hands trembled when he carried in groceries, the truth was unmistakable. The balance between man and beast was shifting, and David's devotion was beginning to look less like mastery and more like denial. The first time David's neighbor noticed the bandages, it was only a strip of gauze wrapped hastily around his hand, the kind of wound that could be explained away with a muttered excuse about kitchen knives or clumsy yard work. But as the months passed, those injuries multiplied: thin scratches along his forearms, small punctures that dotted his skin like a pattern, a jagged bite on his calf that he explained as a mishap during feeding. Each mark was brushed aside with a faint smile, shrugged off as nothing more than the price of devotion, and when pressed, he would repeat the refrain he had clung to for years: "They know me. I can handle it." Yet even as his words insisted on control, his life outside those walls evaporated. He stopped attending family gatherings, ignored invitations from the few friends who still reached out, and even abandoned the simple routines of grocery shopping, relying instead on bulk deliveries of raw meat stacked high at his door. Inside his house, time collapsed into a single, endless ritual of feeding, cleaning, tending, and watching, as if he existed only to orbit the lives of the lizards. His own meals became irregular, his body leaner, his clothes stained and unkempt, while the reptiles grew heavier, more muscular, their dominance filling the dim rooms like an unseen weight. The house no longer felt like his, it felt like theirs. The walls echoed with their movements, the air thick with their smell, until it seemed as if he had been absorbed into their world, rather than them into his. Nights blurred into days, his sleep broken by the scrape of claws or the sudden crash of overturned objects. He told himself he was the caretaker, the master of this small kingdom. But with each wound ignored, with each hour surrendered to their demands, the truth edged closer. He was no longer their keeper, but their servant, bound to their hunger, his will eroded by the constant vigilance they required. It was a transformation so slow that even he could not see it clearly. But to anyone looking in from the outside, the line had already shifted. The man and his monitors locked in a relationship where love had dissolved into captivity, and the cage was not the glass that held the lizards, but the life that now held David himself. On the morning of his final day, David Camper appeared at the local market carrying the same worn canvas bag he had used for years. Its seams stretched from countless trips to the butcher's counter. The vendors recognized him by now, an odd, solitary figure who purchased only raw meat in quantities that seemed disproportionate for a man who lived alone. That morning, though, there was something different in his demeanor. He moved more slowly, his shoulders stooped as if bearing an invisible weight. His eyes dulled with the kind of quiet resignation that speaks not of weariness, but of surrender. He offered no small talk, no nod of recognition beyond the bare minimum to complete his transaction. As he handed over cash and gathered the cold, dripping parcels into his bag, those nearby remarked afterward that it was as if he were performing the motions of a ritual he no longer believed in but could not abandon. Outside, the sky hung low with heavy clouds, the air swollen with humidity that pressed against the skin like a warning. Leaves clung damply to the sidewalks, and even the birds seemed muted, their calls swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Nature itself seemed to echo the unease, the kind of weather that makes people glance nervously at the horizon, though no storm has yet broken. David walked home beneath that sky, each step slow, the bag pulling heavily at his side, leaving faint streaks of moisture along his jeans. To passers-by, he looked like a man deep in thought, but in truth there was little left to think about. His life had narrowed to this single act of feeding, repeated endlessly, until even he seemed to know it would not last much longer. Neighbors who saw him return that day described him as a man walking into shadow, the kind of presence that leaves behind a chill even after he has passed. The house, already shrouded in mystery, seemed darker than usual as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, sealing himself once more into the world he had created, a world that was no longer entirely his own. Outside, thunder murmured faintly in the distance, as if the sky itself was waiting for the storm to break. Hours before his death, David Camper sat in the dim glow of his reptile room, a space that no longer resembled a hobbyist's collection, but a sanctum given over to something older and more primal. The air was heavy with heat from the lamps, and the smell of damp substrate and raw meat, a suffocating closeness that pressed down on the walls. Cameras he had set up long ago to document feedings flickered faintly, their red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes, capturing what would become his final testament. On the floor he knelt, knees pressed into the grit and dust, his bag of meat open beside him like an offering bowl. His voice, low and steady, filled the silence as he spoke to the lizards the way another man might speak to family. "Easy now. I've got you. Steady." His words carried tenderness but also fatigue, the kind of weariness that comes when devotion has stretched itself thin over years. His body seemed smaller that night, his frame frail in the dim light, shoulders hunched, as if each movement demanded more effort than he could spare. In stark contrast, the monitors loomed with quiet power, their muscular bodies coiled and waiting, claws scraping against glass in slow, deliberate rhythms. Their tongues flickered, tasting the air, the rhythm almost synchronized, a silent chorus of hunger and anticipation. In the footage, David reaches toward them with bare hands. No gloves, no barriers, only trust that had once seemed like strength but now looked like surrender. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, his breathing shallow, his eyes locked on theirs, as though waiting for an answer they could never give. The symbolism was unmistakable. The caretaker no longer appeared as master, but as supplicant. The roles had shifted, and though he did not speak it, his body told the truth. He looked frail, his movements hesitant, while they looked powerful, patient, inevitable. The cameras kept rolling, their hum blending with the low hiss of heat lamps, preserving the image of a man whose control was slipping away, even as he clung desperately to the rituals that had defined his life. In those hours, the fragile truce between devotion and instinct trembled on its final thread. And though David could not see it, every recorded second revealed a balance tipping beyond recovery. It happened in an instant. The silence ruptured by a sudden eruption of movement so swift it blurred the line between ritual and nightmare. One moment, David was lowering meat into the enclosure, his voice steady, almost soothing. And the next, the monitors surged forward with a speed that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. their bodies colliding into him with a violence that knocked the tray from his hands. His gasp broke the air, sharp and startled, followed immediately by the rasp of claws raking across skin, tearing through fabric, dragging him down against the floor he had knelt on so many times before. The heat lamps overhead shuddered violently, one crashing to the ground and exploding in a spray of glass that threw sparks across the room, plunging corners into sudden darkness. Shadows leapt along the walls as the lizards swarmed, their tails thrashing, jaws snapping with the wet sound of tearing flesh, each strike precise and unrelenting. The cameras captured fragments, a hand jerking upward in futile defense, the flicker of a tongue darting against his face, the overturned bag of meat spilling across the floor as if mocking the offering that had meant nothing. His voice, once calm, now fractured into cries cut short by the weight pressing down on him. The room filled with chaos, hissing, crashing, the sound of his body struggling against creatures whose strength had been underestimated until this very moment. It was not a battle but an inevitability, a storm of instinct breaking loose in the confined space of a suburban house. In that frenzy, the metaphor became reality. Ancient hunger awakened in a modern home, the echoes of a prehistoric order reclaiming dominance over human devotion. For all his years of care, for all his insistence that they were family, the monitors saw only flesh, only weakness, only the chance to consume. The final images from the recording showed a swirl of motion, claws flashing, shadows collapsing inward, until the man who had given his life to them was swallowed by the creatures he believed he understood. Days later, the uneasy silence that had settled over David Camper's street was broken not by his presence, but by the complaints of neighbors who could no longer ignore the stench seeping from his home, a foul odor that clung to the humid summer air and drew concerned calls to the authorities. When police forced their way inside, they were met with a scene that froze even seasoned officers in place. The reptile room dim and heavy with heat, its walls smeared with the marks of struggle, the floor littered with shards of glass from fallen lamps, and the remnants of a life violently ended. Only fragments of David remained scattered, unrecognizable, stripped down to what his monitors had spared, the rest consumed in the silence of days gone unnoticed. Yet the lizards themselves were calm, basking beneath their lamps with bellies swollen, their tongues flicking lazily at the air as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, as though they had simply continued the cycle they were born into. To them there was no crime, no tragedy, no betrayal, only hunger met, instinct fulfilled. For investigators, the reality was inescapable. A man who had built his life around creatures older and colder than human memory had been undone not by malice, but by inevitability. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering the same phrases they had spoken for years. "We warned him. We knew something like this would happen." Their words carrying both sorrow and a faint edge of grim confirmation. News crews soon arrived, cameras capturing the flashing lights against the quiet houses, headlines already forming that reduced a lifetime of obsession into a single grotesque event. But the truth, as heavy and unshakable as the air in that reptile room, lay in what the scene revealed. Devotion is no shield against instinct, and love cannot rewrite the laws of nature. As the animals were removed one by one, their bodies restrained but their eyes still glinting with the same ancient patience, the question remained suspended in the silence they left behind. When devotion blinds us to instinct, what happens when the creatures we sought to tame finally remind us what they are?